Today's podcast video is on sponsored bills. What are they and why do they matter? To those who generally don't operate in or around the California state capitol, the idea of a sponsored bill is a relatively unknown topic, but the media often focuses on sponsored bills and are most often critical. To make things a little more confusing, at the federal level in Congress, the term sponsor means the legislator, the U.S. House representative or the U.S. senator whose name is on the bill. However, on the other hand, in the California legislature, the legislator whose name is on the bill, the senator or assembly member, we call the author of the bill rather than the sponsor. So in California, in the legislative process, sponsor refers to the individual or the group. Even the legislator himself or herself could be the sponsor, but the individual or group who brought the bill to the legislator, who then in turn authors that measure on behalf of the sponsor. The Office of Legislative Counsel describes the sponsor as the legislator, private individual, or group who developed a piece of legislation and advocates for its passage. So, what's the general criticism of sponsored bills that the media generally portrays? The claim is basically that legislators and legislative staff don't draft or fully understand the contents of a sponsored bill, and that the sponsor gets to unilaterally call all the shots when it comes to the sponsored bill. In fact, sometimes the media accuse legislators and staff of not doing any work on sponsored bills. But I believe that these types of critics of sponsored bills don't understand what does and does not occur with them. And I also think misunderstand that it's not just legislators or their staff who should come up with ideas for legislation. Constituents obviously could very well propose legislation, and naturally interest groups do as well when they determine that a change in the law should occur. But really, legislators and staff do in fact know the contents of their sponsored bills and know they rarely defer all decision making to the sponsors of their bills. I think a lot of the criticisms lodged by the general media are unwarranted, and I think demonstrate perhaps a misunderstanding of how things actually operate in the California legislative process. Legislators sometimes solicit bill ideas from individuals, groups, their constituents, and for example, there ought to be a law contest or other means by getting potential bill ideas. And they're obviously trying to be responsive to constituents, to community groups, or other organizations. So there are lots of examples of sponsors who can bring ideas for legislation to be considered by the legislature. Whether the sponsor brings forth an idea for a bill or drafts it or whatnot, ultimately the Office of Legislative Counsel does the final drafting and formatting of all bills and amendments for consideration in the California legislature. As we know, a bill in order to be introduced, a bill in order to be amended, those amendments for that bill must be in legislative counsel form. So sometimes bill language is certainly drafted to implement statutory changes that are decided. Ultimately the bill's author decides whether or not he or she's going to carry the bill or not. And in the end, that legislator and his or her 119 colleagues who are obviously elected by the voters of the state of California to serve in the California legislature, as well as the governor, the general public, and other interest groups, all can and do, in fact, have input into a bill's language and consideration of it. So even with sponsored bills, a bill author and his or her staff have to do a lot of work for the bill, just as if they were the ones who came up with the original idea for the bill. They have to work with legislative counsel on drafting or revising the original bill language or any amendments. They also have to develop, perhaps in consultation with the bill sponsor, a fact sheet or background information, which is where you usually disclose the bill's sponsor, and provide relevant information to promote the bill. Even if the sponsor in these cases writes some of the initial materials, they're always revised by the author's staff. The author staff also has to complete and submit committee worksheets or committee background materials, often writing talking points for the legislator. They often help solicit groups to support the measure. They deal with opposition. They work with committee and floor and leadership staff on the bill. They naturally advocate for the bill's passage, whether talking with other legislative staff or committee staff in both houses. They have to respond to the public requests about the bill, any press inquiries. The bill author staff, again, even for sponsored bills, often write news releases. They have to handle all the necessary legislative paperwork as the bill travels through the legislative process. So bills as introduced rarely make it through the entire process without getting amended, let alone make it through one individual house. So even if your bill is brought to you by a sponsor and even drafted by them, the bill still has to go through committees in both houses and the floors of both houses, generally at least for a policy and fiscal committee in the Assembly and a policy and fiscal committee on the Senate side, and of course, both floors. So ultimately, all 120 legislators are going to be able to review the bill and vote upon it. So in the end, a sponsored bill doesn't mean that the legislator has relinquished control or left the stage in the lawmaking process, as some critics of it have claimed. Remember, in the end, the only name on the bill is that of the legislator, the author of the bill, who's ultimately responsible for what the contents of those bills are. The sponsor's name does not appear anywhere on the bill in the end.